I will just go through the panel and introduce the speakers. We are really pleased to have this morning Patricia Landau, Assistant Professor of Sociology at the University of Toronto, Cynthia Buckley, Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Texas at Austin, Oksana Chavel, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Tufts University, and Davat Kudonazarov, who is the Senior Research Fellow at the Russian Academy of Sciences. And I want to say that we're especially pleased to have you here this morning, and I understand this is your first speech in English, and we're very we're very glad to have you here. So each speaker is going to take about 15 minutes, and then we will open up for discussion. We have about an hour for discussion, and I know that there were a lot of questions left unanswered for the morning speakers, so we can also address questions to the morning speakers in the discussion session. So let's go ahead and get started with Patricia Landau.
Thank you. Good morning. It's an honor to be here. I'm going to be speaking from a project that we've been developing over the last couple of years in Toronto, looking at Latin American immigrants, and particularly the political incorporation processes of Chileans, Salvadorans, Guatemalans, and Colombians. The overarching project is called Places of Settlement, Projects of Return, Latin American Immigrants in Toronto, and it's a project that we've developed with Lewin Goldring at York University, also in Toronto. So the way we frame it, and what I'd really like to focus on here, is the whole notion of immigrant political incorporation, which by now the literature defines as a context-contingent process of political socialization that occurs in a variety of institutions. So those institutions might range from immigrant participation and political socialization in hometown associations, in the union, in community gardening projects. So the range is really quite broad, and it points out the idea that political socialization and the process of political incorporation is about pathways and trajectories through institutions rather than any marked threshold of citizenship, naturalization, voting, right? Within that, there's two tensions that we have tried to address in the project. One has to do with trying to whether we should get at pathways of political incorporation by looking at the behavior of individuals, or whether we should look at the range of organizations that an immigrant group or a migrant wave develops to understand their variable outcomes. The other tension we're interested in looking at is the relationship between trajectories of incorporation or institutions that are transnational in their logic and others that are assimilative, and the relationship between these. In other words, we may see a hometown association, which is kind of transnational form that's quite common in the United States, although not in Canada for Latin Americans. We might see that as something that would suggest a transnational trajectory of incorporation, but over time see that organization involve people in more assimilative processes as they learn about a set of institutions in the city in which they're settled. So that is a tension we're interested in looking at. In our discussion, we look at the organizational trajectories of these four Latin American groups, and we focus on the early settlement period and the kinds of organizations that groups develop. The reason we focus on settlement is that, as you may know, in Canada, immigration policy includes not only the issue of selection, so who gets across the border, but also that there's a strong government project to use the early settlement period as a pathway for political socialization. So the Canadian settlement services model involves funding non-voluntary sector organizations to deliver a set of services that are considered key in the settlement process. So rather than chasing charities, which is what Walter Tejada talks about, in Canada the government offers funding to voluntary sector organizations to conduct a range of activities that in theory facilitate settlement. When we look at the four groups that we're interested in, what these four groups, Chileans, Salvadorans, Guatemalans, and Colombians, represent are three of five distinct waves of Latin American migration to Canada. Latin American migration to Canada is not a replenishing migration, unlike Latin American migration to the United States, where social networks and informal trajectories are kind of core to explaining movement and settlement. In Canada, each of the five waves of Latin American migration begins from point of refugee migration where the Canadian state recognizes the population as being from a refugee-producing country. And so in each case, we see at least 30% of that country's or national origin population entering as a refugee accepted by the government or as an asylum seeker. So that's an important difference. In our project, there's a crazy page. We conducted, it means nothing, it means everything. We conducted 18 thematic focus groups with community activists, beginning with country of origin community activists, and we basically asked them to chart their organizational trajectories from when they first arrived in the country. And this is the Chileans, all right? I could show you others, it would look slightly different. And what we asked them to do was to say, over time, talk about your organizational agendas, your priorities, your basis for organizing. Like, was it partisan allegiance, religious identity, ethnic identity, migrant networks? What is it that put this organization together for you? What kinds of allies did you develop or institutional interlocutors did you develop in Toronto, across Canada, in your country of origin, but also in Europe? All right? This kind of charting exercise allowed us to establish longitudinal pictures of organizational trajectories for each country of origin group. So it allows us to capture geographic reach of organizational networks, scalar reach, and their sectoral range. In other words, we could see, for instance, if a national origin group began with a focus on organizations that dealt with economic issues and then fanned out to deal with cultural, political, religious, or whether they moved across sectors over time. All right? So in a sense, we're able to construct institutional pathways of political incorporation. Now, I'd like to talk about the 4 cases, and what I'd like to do is leave this up because in each of the case studies that I'll talk about briefly, I'm going to talk about context of exit that frames the migration, in particular the notion of political violence and how it affects the group's expectations about their story, basically, of why they're in Canada, how long they expect to be there. We also are interested in the relationship with host society institutions in that early settlement period. We also talk about the ways of doing politics that the immigrant group brings with them, and finally the range of institutional interlocutors. And this, I'll leave that up and I'll talk through the cases, and as I look at the dimensions and the variation across the groups, it'll give you a sense of why we identified those as important factors to explain variation in pathways of political incorporation. For Chileans, what we see is a migration that begins after 1973 and that continues through to the mid-80s. And it's a migration that is obviously comes out of the coup that overthrows socialist President Salvador Allende and the dictatorship that follows that. This is a group that has an expectation, sees itself as an exile group that doesn't plan on settling in Canada, and where political violence is experienced as very targeted, right? And that in a sense generates social cohesion. It's bounded solidarity based on party allegiances to different parties involved in the socialist project of Allende. That is a kind of basis for organizing in the early settlement period. So the Chilean settlement agenda in Toronto reflects the importance of partisan organizations and the predominance of the exile agenda. Settlement concerns that engagement with the host institutions emerge as part of a transnational political agenda that focuses on regime change in Chile. So, for instance, the Toronto Chilean Society, which was an inter-party organization founded in about 1975, created something called the Escuela Presidente Salvador Allende, or the EPSA, which was a school that basically focused on teaching kids Spanish and Chilean history, but that also saw itself as developing Chilean kids' self-esteem, which was considered important for children's success in the Canadian school system. And what we see through that institutional moment is the Chilean parents learning about the Canadian school system, and eventually a trajectory that leads to the election of a Chilean woman as a school trustee in the city of Toronto. All right, so that kind of a path is what we're trying to chart. Another example is Barrabases, which was a socialist-run sports club, which on the one hand raised funds for the resistance in Chile and for political prisoners, but it also ran several youth leagues in the city soccer teams. right? So in the Chilean settlement agenda, what we see is the development of autonomous, Chilean-controlled organizations that define an agenda and then proceed to enter into dialogue with Canadian host institutions. So they see this as a dialogue of equals, and the agenda is set by that exiled project and not by Canadian institutions. In the Central American case, we look at political violence as both targeted and widespread, and in the Guatemalan case, as experienced as a genocide. There are, on the one hand, pockets of cohesion that result from that violence and the kind of partisan education that was received in countries of origin, but also strong rivalries within the population, considerably less trust among the Guatemalans. And so we have mixed socially expected durations of how long we're going to be in Toronto and in Canada, right? Some with a project of return to countries of origin, and others with a project of that country is violence, that's all I remember about it, I never want to go back. So in that context, Central American settlement issues emerge discursively in a dialogue with transnational politics, but organizationally distinct from guerrilla-linked transnational organizations that are present in the city of Toronto. Those organizations linked to the FMLN and the URNG try to develop a settlement agenda, but it's completely disconnected from Canadian institutions and basically peters out in the context of the signing of the peace accords. A second set of settlement agendas for Central Americans emerge under the auspices of faith-based non-governmental organizations that participate in the settlement process, like the Quaker Refugee Committee and the Jesuit Center for Social Faith and Justice. And in that context, we see the emergence of mutual aid organizations that begin with, very straightforward weekly meetings to share information and with a real emphasis on getting past the traumas of violence that refugees had gone through in countries of origin, and from that, developing a series of cross-sectoral initiatives, women's organizations, into the soccer leagues, into the school system. However, in this case, all of those initiatives take place under the auspices of Canadian faith-based run organizations, which is very different from the Chilean case where there's an autonomous dialogue. The final case I'm looking at has to do with Colombia, which is the most recent refugee-initiated migration wave of Latin Americans to Toronto, and it's a migration that begins in the mid-90s and continues to the present. In the case of Colombia, as we know, their political violence has been ongoing for the last 50 years, and we can now, under Uribe in particular, see a paramilitarization of social life. So political violence is not attached to a political project that people would be for or against. At this point, it feels, at least for the Colombians in Toronto, as just uncertain, arbitrary, and with nothing that they can either oppose, or it's a question of just avoiding politics and hoping to hell you can avoid the violence that comes with it, right? Social capital in this group is thoroughly eroded. There's social isolation and there's fragmentation. And so when we see the emergence of a settlement agenda, it is adamantly apolitical and issue-based. Friendship and very pragmatic concerns serve as the basis for generating a settlement agenda. So we see Colombians creating, across a series of sectoral arenas, issue-specific organizations. So, for instance, Colombian professionals concerned about accreditation, Colombian families concerned about speedy family reunification. None of those organizations fan out sectorally. They stick to that one issue. There is no cross-institutional overlaps or collaboration. And the relationship with host society institutions, including the settlement institutions, is perfunctory. Give us a room, we want to meet. That's it, all right? There is no ongoing dialogue, all right? So, through this, what we're trying to get at is the idea of mapping pathways of political incorporation. We talk about unpacking contextual factors. There's a classic article, and I'm sure we're all familiar with it, of Portas and Boros, 1989, International Migration Review, where they ask this really basic question. Why is it that people with similar levels of human capital end up on very different paths in terms of socioeconomic outcomes or modes of incorporation? In a sense, what we're trying to get at is explaining why is it that groups end up with very different trajectories of political incorporation, right? Starting out with what appear to be fairly similar in terms of the context of exit, context of reception, the framework that we were handed by Portas and Boros, we would see these as very similar groups coming out of involuntary migration, with a mix of educated and uneducated, with a certain degree of political socialization, etc. What we're trying to do is unpack those contextual factors to identify what are conceptually relevant contextual factors that might explain variation in modes of political incorporation. So it's not simply about being voluntary or involuntary migrants, because in these cases they can all be framed as involuntary refugee migrations, but rather to look at the role of political violence and the modes that political violence takes to explain the constitution or the sources of social capital that the group has or doesn't have. We're also interested in explaining, out of those contextual variables, what the differences in the ways of doing politics that these different groups have. So we can talk about Chileans having a way of doing politics that's all about political parties, Central Americans much more a social movement approach to doing politics, and Colombians an effort to avoid looking like they're doing anything that might be considered political. All right? So those paths are important for explaining, for instance, why a settlement agenda looks different. What are the issues that emerge? How are organizations constituted? But they also allow us to look at the relationship between that immigrant group and a set of host society institutions, right? So we see the Chileans with this autonomous dialogue, the Central Americans is embedded, and the Colombians is perfunctory. So rather than, the original kind of paths of political incorporation would have said, we want to figure out how context of exit and reception to explain the types of organizations that immigrants create. Well, no, actually that I think is the first step, because the next step is to say, okay, fine, they create different kinds of organizations, and the ways and the modes and the basis for organizing vary. But the second step is to say, given that, what kinds of dialogues do they enter into with different kinds of organizations of the host society, right? So I think it's that organizational relationship which allows us to begin to chart variable pathways of incorporation over time. Thank you.
Okay, and now we'll turn to Cynthia Buckley.
Yeah, another kind of a happy topic. I'm going to try and tie this in. I'm not quite sure how, but Piers closed the last session with a really insightful comment about the importance of cultural resonance in the ability to use migrants as a mobilizer, or use issues of migration as a mobilization issue for xenophobic goals, or usually xenophobic goals as a beard for other political goals, often economic. I think in this case, I'm going to talk about the Eurasian migration system and talk about two topics that have a lot of cultural traction right now: health and migration, and talk about the ways in which health has provided anti-migrant groups a new form of traction, especially given now with high rates of economic growth and increasing economic stability in the Russian Federation. The economic argument about migration was starting to lose a bit of traction. Health comes in and off the bench as an extraordinarily effective backup player. And so I'm going to talk about, how do I do? Nothing, evidently. Sorry about that. There we go. We don't have this stuff in Texas. We're one of those colonias on the border. I've got three goals. And the first thing, I want to talk a little bit about theoretical links in the literature and more globally, empirical research about links of health behaviors, health outcomes, and migration, particularly focusing on selectivity. I want to talk about the contrast between popular portrayals of migrants as carriers of disease, and that occurs both at destination and at origin. Migrants coming back, particularly in Central Asia and the Caucasus, are seen as these potential harbingers of infectious disease, particularly in terms of TB and HIV. And then I want to close with kind of a plea, perhaps, to talk about the importance of integrating evidence-based assessments of health into migration debates. What we find is, very similar to debates about economics, that the actual truth about health and migration points to healthy migrant selectivity. The fact that actually Russia, particularly, and the Ukraine to a certain extent, benefits, given their very poor health status at present, from healthy migrants moving in, who tend to have lower rates of alcohol consumption, lower rates of smoking, better health behaviors, and typically provide a demographic, if you will, revitalization of local populations. Did that work? Okay. But that's not usually how it gets played. There we go. Migrants are typically played, particularly in the political sphere, and this has a lot of cultural traction, particularly in Russia now, as the diseased other, right? They're an external threat, spreading communicable diseases. This is certainly something that's used often in the U.S., right? Migrants bring plague and leprosy. They're operating in an unregulated underground economy and therefore generating health threats. And this was a protest in Moscow talking about how immigrants made food that had worms in it, and then you bought it and you got sick, right? We import our toxic goods from China. They have immigrants come and make the toxic goods there within Russia. Migrants are seen as the embodiment, quite literally, of underdevelopment. They have questionable health practices. They haven't been immunized. They don't go to the doctor like we do. They might not have the same culturally defined ideas of health. And more importantly, in terms of structure and infrastructure, a question that was brought up earlier, they have very little access to health care at destination. And so there is this idea that these are people who are oftentimes employed in dangerous, dirty, and demeaning work. They are at health risk for injury, and they have very little opportunity to seek treatment. But it's not just at destinations that migrants are seen as this sort of diseased other. In work that I've just completed on migrant sending families in the Caucasus, health came up again and again. Actually looking at labor migration, particularly these transnational migration flows in the Eurasian system, as the exporting of health resources. Our men, not just my husband, work like slaves, eat poorly, endure horrible conditions, they returned ruined, selling their health for wages. This is a theme that comes up again and again, people coming back with the negative impact of having been injured and not being able to acquire health care services, or simply having spent their physical capacity in very, very physically demanding jobs while in migration to Russia or Ukraine, some other destinations to a lesser extent. More importantly, structurally, from the political side, across the ministries of health in Central Asia and the Southern Caucasus, returning Russian migrants in particular are targeted out, both in terms of how statistics are kept, but also in terms of general discourse about health. They are the ones that bring in HIV infections. They are the ones that bring in tuberculosis infections. They are the ones that come back with various forms of hepatitis, particularly B and C. And this is the way in which Russia is still exploiting those colonies, and that's where diseases are coming through. So both at destination and at origin, migrants are seen as this sort of disease vector, if you will, especially in the context of rising HIV rates, extraordinarily high growth in both basic and multi-drug resistant tuberculosis. This is a really resonant fact, and framing migrants as these disease vectors is something that comes across in political discussions as well as in the media. Which is kind of ironic, because if indeed that's the case, that migrants are these diseased others, then we really need to look at the Eurasian system, because it seriously differs from the accumulated empirical existence of migrant movements across the globe. Typically, what we find in Western Europe and North America is that immigrants often exhibit better physical and mental health than the native born. This is especially true for migrants who live in enclaves, who are resident in urban areas, particularly true in the United States, where Hispanic birth outcomes for the foreign-born are better than native-born Hispanic and better than non-Hispanic white, even if, in some cases, like the state of Texas, even without controlling for socioeconomic status. There's a couple of reasons why this might be. One that's been offered in the literature and proven to a certain extent with Mexican migration into the U.S. is the salmon effect, that healthy migrants move to a destination. When they become sick, they have no choice but to return home. So that when you look at the foreign-born at any destination, you're only getting the best and the brightest, because those who become ill return home. There seems to be some indication of this, particularly in Azerbaijan and Georgia, where men returning from Russia seem to exhibit higher levels of stress. According to the ministries of health in both those countries, are much more likely to suffer cardiovascular disease, are much more likely to drink heavily and smoke heavily. Now, whether this is, again, that targeting of migrants, it's hard to say. Clear data is somewhat lacking on this. But there is some evidence of this salmon effect influencing the situation in the Eurasian system. Something to keep in mind, we've talked about assimilation and integration as something that's good for migrants. And that's not always true, particularly in terms of health behaviors, and particularly in terms of moving to what some scholars would call toxic health environments. That's usually used in terms of thinking about the health behaviors of Americans. I think among scholars we could get a lot of traction with the idea that Russia's also got a somewhat toxic health environment. I don't think that's a big leap of faith. But when we look at large-scale surveys like the RLMS, where you have limited access to foreign-born but at least a few indicators, migrants display significantly lower levels of a lot of negative health behaviors. They smoke less, they drink less. But then if you flip it around and link it to issues of infrastructure, you find a different pattern. They are at elevated risk for contextual risk, right? They live in crowded conditions, they have poor nutrition. Those sorts of things are amplified, even if the parentheses is not closed, among Russian migrants. Then the last issue is that of selectivity. And I think, this is preaching to the choir. I'm sure everyone in the room is sympathetic to the fact that we have a tendency in policy discussions or in framing discussions to talk about migrants as a undifferentiated sack of potatoes, I think is the appropriate metaphor. Concentrated, but to think about migrant selectivity. Migrants tend to be concentrated in the younger working ages. They tend to be positively selective for health. They can assist in demographic revitalization in aging societies. This is certainly something that the European Union is acutely aware of, and something that I would think most financial projections with Social Security in the United States would be happy to point out. However, those sorts of ideas of positive selectivity in healthy migrants don't exist in terms of popular discourse, particularly in terms of the media. In an investigation with one of my graduate students at Texas, Wilson Gretschel, what we found is in Russian press portrayals, just in over 3 years, we found 186 major articles that really focus on issues of migrants as health threats. So one's coming out about once a week, and these are in the big newspapers. Things get said that rival things that get said here, I guess, about migrants as health threats. One of the more egregious statements was in Pravda at the end of 2006, saying that HIV infections were 15 times higher among migrants than among native-born. No data provided for this, of course, but 15, and it's always a multiple of 5, right? 15 percent higher, certainly a hot button issue and something with a lot of cultural resonance. They also mention issues of internal disease, sexually transmitted diseases, leprosy. Leprosy is always a big one. That's true in the United States as well. What's interesting is that across all of these 186 articles, there's never any differentiation between individual health behaviors and contextual health risks. So in talking about tuberculosis and crowded conditions, or intestinal disease and bad water, those sorts of things never come up. There's some mention, about 17% of and that's a real generous coding, 17% of the articles bring up issues of demographic revitalization, but only 2 of these 186 articles even mention the idea of health in a positive way. in terms of health revitalization. It's something that's just not part of the popular discourse. And this is also true in the sending regions. I'm sure we're about to hear much more about the Tajik case. The Tajik press, the major national weeklies, devote a section to migration, again, showing the importance of migration as a means of economic survival in Tajikistan. They talk about issues of violence, and it's devoted to migrant issues, and there's a little bit on migrant health, but again, it tends to focus on this idea that health is spent in Russia as part of the export of human capital, so to speak, and that migrants coming back suffer severe detrimental health consequences. The national aid centers in the Caucasus also all note that migrants returning from Ukraine and Russia particularly contribute significantly to increased HIV prevalence. If you go just to their website, even looking at the general statistics, they are very specific to point out that migrants, all cases that are linked to labor migration, are coming from Russia and Ukraine, regardless of where the person migrated from. In one case, the director of the Azerbaijan AIDS Center justified this in saying, well, they always transit through Ukraine or Russia. But again, it's a very clear way of painting the migrant as a diseased other, and indeed putting blame for the spread of the pandemic on Russia and Ukraine. Discussions about pension and insurance issues are now just beginning to emerge. In terms of the press reports in the Southern Caucasus, only now are ministries of health starting to link this idea of sick migrants coming back with state responsibility to provide health care and issues of old age pensions, but that's still just in the works. So, to conclude, I just want to again point out that focusing on health and migration seems to make an enormous amount of sense in bringing together issues of transnationalism and also migrant assimilation. This is an increasingly important issue in Eurasia, and while my tongue-in-cheek report that perhaps Eurasia is just unique and there isn't positive health selectivity, there is health selectivity. We need to study it more in depth. We need to think about migrants as diverse groups and document these sorts of things more. Tolerance depends on the characteristics of migrants, both the characteristics they actually have as well as our perceptions of their characteristics. And given that health is now the new harbinger of the other in the Eurasian system, more attention on health would be useful. It's difficult to study health effects in this region, however, because there's been very little data collected on migration duration, as well as linking health records to foreign-born status. I think linking them to citizenship status, certainly in the United States, has never proven effective, and I wouldn't be a prudent policy option at this point in time. But encouraging organizations in the region to think about health as an issue is extraordinarily important. One well-known NGO in Moscow, Tajikistan, that works with Tajik migrants, put it this way. They argued that actually Tajik migrants are at the worst position of all. Other migrant groups, particularly they cited the Armenians, have local co-ethnics who are dentists and doctors, particularly in large metropolitan areas like Moscow and St. Petersburg. The Tajiks, however, don't have as many in their group because of their lower socioeconomic status, and therefore they see themselves at a particular health risk. Thinking about how migration networks and assimilation processes and the existence of enclaves can facilitate access to health care above and beyond sort of legalistic approaches as to whether migrants have the right to go to clinics or not could do a lot towards unpacking how health influences migration in this region. More and better health data is definitely needed. We need to think clearly about this issue if we're going to adequately measure the costs and benefits of migration, both at the destination and the origin of these migrants. The session, this is the second session on tolerance, and one of the things I wanted to point out is that, of course, tolerance, as we know, and ignorance are extraordinarily highly correlated. I think there has been quite a lot of discussion in the press in Russia, in the academic literature across Eurasia, about the economic contributions of migrants, and certainly that's the case in the United States as well. Unfortunately, I think both in the U.S. and in the Eurasian migration system, we seem to find a persistent ignorance about the positive health selectivity of migrants, which does tend to lead towards ignorance and the framing of migrants as a diseased other. This could be a huge obstacle for developing more tolerant approaches to labor migrants, both in the Eurasian migration system as well as here in the United States. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, and now we'll move on to Oksana Shiva.
I don't have a PowerPoint. Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. And in my comments today, I'll focus on things that I've been doing research on, which is the politics of policymaking, especially of refugee policymaking in the post-Soviet region, and especially in Russia and Ukraine. And I think in what I'm going to be talking about, it's probably going to relate to the discussion we had already a little bit this morning about the importance of state policies relative to social perceptions. So perhaps things that I'll say might contribute to that discussion. Now, I want to begin with highlighting perhaps obvious, but I think also important way in which migration and refugee policymaking in the post-Soviet region has been very different. Certainly has been in the 90s, and I would say still is, from migration refugee policymaking in more developed Western countries. These differences have to do with the virtual absence of many of the so-called traditional sources of refugee policies. So if, say, you want to analyze refugee politics and policies in the US, in Canada, in Western Europe, most scholars would look at such things as, say, the position of major political parties. Something has been mentioned before with the parties on the left, sometimes known to be more receptive, sort of more tolerant than right-wing parties. Also, the position of institutions such as courts have been known to be important, that the courts have been shown to play liberalizing influence on these kinds of policies in Western Europe. And, in addition, there are all these institutional legislative legacies, entrenched interest groups, say migrant interest groups, employers of foreign labor, immigrant organizations, sort of all of these actors that shape migration and refugee policies in Western countries. Now, what's interesting about the post-Soviet case is that virtually all of these sources have been basically non-existent. The reason they've been non-existent, as you all know, that in 1991, 92, when these countries first they basically faced this migration, global migration, transnational migration, refugee movements for the first time. There were simply no legislative legacy or institutional legacy that existed. These countries didn't have refugee laws and migration legislation. So actors such as political parties, again, these countries were democratizing for the first time. There was no party system. There was no stable kind of parties that would have position on these issues. Just to give one evidence from the research that I've done, in late 90s, I talked to representatives of all political parties in the Czech Republic, which is considered to have one of the strongest well-established party systems, and they all said, without exception, that their party has no view on migration, refugee issues, doesn't enforce voting discipline on these, right? So again, if you want to understand sort of how these policies are being made, looking at some of these traditional sources of these policies hasn't been very helpful. Now, on the other hand, sort of having said that, so what actually does influence migration, refugee policymaking in the post-Soviet region? I think particularly important factor is debates about who actually constitutes the nation, who is us and who is the other. And here we have, again, another important and I think is crucial difference, that in the post-Soviet space, migrants and refugees began to come in at the same time as these countries emerged as independent states, and they had to basically figure out who belongs to the nation, right? And we had this presentation in South Africa where Professor Landau mentioned how in African cases, sometimes sort of this concept, who is us, who is the other, is not quite clear. And this is I would say all the more so the case in the post-Soviet region, because who exactly is a foreigner, right? So, okay, who is it a person who was born abroad? But what is abroad is somebody who is born, say, in Tajikistan or in the Baltic states is a foreigner in Russia or in Ukraine, in the same way that somebody who was, say, born in China, right? So this sort of question, who is a refugee, who is a foreigner, was debated at the same time as the countries faced this migration and refugee flows. And I would say that basically for the last 10, 15 years, these debates about who actually constitutes the nation have been a major factor affecting the content of refugee and migration policies in these states. So this, one could say that these debates about the nation and immigration policies are linked everywhere, perhaps so, definitely so. But I think they're all the more linked and all the more consequential in the post-Soviet region, not least because these other sources of refugee policy, such as economic interests, party politics, courts, and so forth, have been absent. Now, sort of the way these debates affected migration and refugee, so debates about the nation, the way they affected migration, the content of migration and refugee policies, I think has been interesting and oftentimes has been quite counterintuitive. And again, I just want to give an example from the research that I've done comparing Russia and Ukraine. There has been this interesting phenomena in the 1990s. Both Russia and Ukraine faced, Russia more so, definitely in absolute terms, but actually relative to the population, the per capita in migration from the other Soviet republics to Russia and Ukraine have been quite comparable. And a lot of the so-called co-ethnics came in. So a lot of ethnic Ukrainians came back to Ukraine, a lot of ethnic Russians came back to Russia from the other former Soviet republics. In addition to that, both countries also faced so-called new foreign migration. The Afghans, the Africans, people from Southeast Asia came to these countries as well, and some of them asked for refugee status. Now, the policies in these two countries have been quite different. In the 1990s, Russia had quite generous, at least, legally. The life of these people was still very difficult, don't take me wrong, but at least as far as the law went, there was quite liberal and receptive legislation that enabled migrants from the former Soviet republics to obtain legal status in Russia as either refugees or forced migrants. At the same time, migrants from what in Russia sometimes is called far abroad, from outside of the former Soviet Union, from the developing world, had very difficult time obtaining refugee status. In Ukraine, it was completely the reverse. There was no preferential treatment for either ethnic Ukrainians or people from the former Soviet Union in general. At the same time, in the 1990s, Afghans were receiving refugee status in quite significant numbers. In fact, like most of the refugees who have legal status in Ukraine are from Afghanistan. Right. So, what contributes to this difference, and what I've found out in my research, is that it's precisely the way the debate on the nation has proceeded differently in Russia and Ukraine, and more specifically that in Russia there has been this general agreement that these people from the former Soviet republics, especially the Russian and the Russian speakers, somehow constitute part of the us. And that translated into more receptive refugee and migration policy toward this group. And again, I say more receptive, it doesn't mean they have a rosy life, but, sort of relatively speaking, right? And in Ukraine, on the other hand, when there was no such agreement, there has been, as we all know, this sort of identity, national issue has been very hotly contested in Ukraine. There isn't really a political consensus at either the elite or the societal level, sort of, exactly who the nation is. And this somehow unexpectedly, rather sort of counterintuitively, opened this political space for more or less equal treatment of different migrant groups, not because the population is less intolerant or the political elites are somehow more enlightened, but simply because there was no agreement on who is the us, and that sort of opens the political space of treating different groups more equally. Now, it brings me to the other point, sort of to what extent this kind of political space that could be opened by contested politics of identity in the post-Soviet region, to what extent this political space would actually be to what extent these policies would actually materialize. And here I want to mention another important, in my view, source of refugee and migration politics in the post-Soviet case is the role of international institutions. It's something that hasn't been mentioned much today, and indeed most not all, but many studies would probably give primacy to domestic sources of these kinds of policies, right? So how the countries respond to refugee and migration challenges has perhaps less to do with what the international institutions or international law has to say, but has more to do with domestic politics and domestic interests and so forth. And I would say, not to say that domestic issues didn't matter in the post-Soviet region, but I would say that in the post-Soviet cases, international institutions definitely have a very important role to play. They don't always manage to capitalize on the opportunity that they have, and I want to say a few words about that, and perhaps we can have some discussion about it later on. Why should international institutions, and here I'm especially talking about UN High Commissioner for Refugees, why should they even be in a position to be influential in the post-Soviet region? And I would say, again, it has to do with the fact that the issues are so novel, and domestic expertise is so few, and domestic entrenched interests are so few, that there is this basically almost like a tabula rasa. So these organizations come in, they are the only expert, they have also financial capacity, not the least. They could actually fund, for example, these government agencies that are being set up. And in the mid-90s, for example, within Ukrainian presidential administration, the department that dealt with citizenship and migration was the only department fully staffed with computers, and this money came from UNHCR. I mean, maybe that's not, some might say that's significant, but I think these bureaucrats appreciated having better sort of even workspace than they would have had otherwise. Now, but so I would say that these international organizations have a potential to exert this influence and oftentimes liberalizing influence in case of UN. But whether or not they would actually succeed, again, depends on to what extent they are aware of how different the politics of migration refugee policy is in the context of the simultaneity of nation building and refugee challenge, right? So if international organization comes in and it has sort of this blueprint in its mind based on the international law, right? International law defines a refugee a certain way, somebody who crossed an international border, right? Now, and they approach these countries where the question who is a refugee is a lot more contested, right? Because of the borders kind of disappeared overnight. And a lot of people who domestically are considered refugees, say within Russia, would not fall under the international legal definition of refugee because they either didn't cross international border or they're entitled to citizenship of Russia, right? So here kind of the challenge comes in terms of promoting more liberal receptive policies toward these groups. Challenge comes to the international organization to be able to recognize this specificity or complexity of the context of refugee policymaking in countries that are simultaneously nation building, experiencing this migration of ethnic admixing and dealing with refugees. And in cases of that I looked at, I found that in Russia initially the UN hasn't quite been aware or wasn't able to sort of think outside of its mandate restrictions, and initially hasn't been very successful. But in Ukraine, it took a different approach from the start, so it sort of underwent this learning process on the basis of experience with Russia, and in UNHCR in Ukraine had a lot more leverage as a result with the national government than it did in Russia, and I could talk more about it later on. Now, for the sake of time, so let me move on, just to have a couple more points, issues I wanted to mention. One is this temporal dimension. So I began by saying how initially refugee and migration policy-making context has been very different in these new states. That has been changing over time, and especially the way it's changing, that some of these more so-called traditional actors of refugee migration policy are now also at play in the post-Soviet space. So organizations such as courts have been known to play an important role and oftentimes been able to champion migrant refugee rights quite successfully by providing legal support for the negative decisions, say if somebody's refugee claim has been denied by the government. Now, the courts sometimes have ruled in favor, and for Russia there is quite impressive statistics of how these NGOs that provide legal aid to refugees, those who are denied refugee status, how they actually win court cases in not insignificant numbers. So that's another thing, like we're talking about ways in which migrants sort of toleration and integration could be promoted. One of it could be this legal avenue that has also been shown to be important in Western Europe. NGOs, I think, already have been mentioned, and again, they're beginning to play more important role in these countries, providing the kind of exactly social services integration support that they've been providing in Western Europe. I mean, it is still at early stages, but definitely worth keeping that in mind. Now, another important factor, and that one is a little bit more controversial, is the impact of the European Union, of this sort of Europeanization of migration refugee politics and what it means for places on the periphery of the EU, countries such as Russia and Ukraine. scholars who have been studying this Europeanization process, not even specifically with regard to migration issues, but kind of in general, have noted that it hasn't been uniformly positive in terms of fostering greater democratization, right? So it seems like, of course, EU is a democratic group of countries. To join the EU, you have to be democracy. This is fine, but people have mentioned things that are important, that some of the effects that the EU had on domestic politics of the candidate states is, for example, stifling really domestic discourse, domestic competition, because of this non-negotiable nature of the acquis. Political parties didn't even compete on real issues. Everybody sort of was for EU, and the argument has been made how that sort of stifled democratic process in the candidate states. And we definitely see, I think one could make an argument that the impact of the EU, sort of direct and indirect impact on refugee and migration, of the content of refugee and migration politics, has not necessarily been in the liberalizing direction, even in countries that are not candidates for membership, such as Russia and Ukraine. These countries have been very quick to adopt some of the more restrictive practices of the EU, such as the imposition of these notions of the safe third country, safe country of origin, whereby people who came from a certain country or transited through a certain country are not even given a chance at a fair hearing, but are channeled through these accelerated procedures or downright not accepted at all. So this is something that has been going on in the EU, but when countries such as Russia and Ukraine adopt these policies, the result for the migrants and refugees is all the more detrimental, because they adopt these restrictive practices without accompanying them by the safeguards found in the legislation and practices of the European Union, whereby there are, I'm not going to go into the legal detail. If anybody is interested, we can talk about sort of how these specific restrictive rules about safe countries and so forth are sometimes mitigated by the way they are applied. This is the case oftentimes in Western democracies, but it hasn't been the case in places such as Russia and Ukraine. As a result, in recent years in Ukraine, like a majority of asylum applicants weren't even able to have their claims heard. They've been rejected sort of at the time of initially submitting their claims because they came from safe countries or they violated the deadlines and so forth. So this kind of the relationship between democratization and kind of becoming closer to Europe and the expected sort of democratizing effect of this process and the tension actually it creates. So some of these effects are not actually that democratizing. I think it's worth keeping in mind and maybe thinking more about it. So how this democracy and refugee protection, how these ideas are related. And if you look at it, as I say, you look at it statistically between the levels of democracy and refugee recognition rates, there isn't any clear relationship. There isn't a clear negative relationship, but there certainly isn't a clear positive relationship. And even if you look anecdotally, say, in the case of Ukraine, after the Orange Revolution, yes, the country is supposedly more democratic, but if you actually look at what has been happening with the treatment of refugees, it is definitely not better, and most would say it's probably worse, and it has been pre-Orange Revolution. There has been cases of deportation, say to Uzbekistan, of people who clearly were, would have been considered refugees under the international law, and the new government, despite its democratic credentials, haven't really quite lived up to its obligation to refugees. So I think this relationship between democracy, democratization, and refugee rights is worth exploring, right? And finally, just the last thing I wanted to mention, again, going back to this, the importance of state policies and the way to the extent to which the law actually matters. I would say the law definitely matters, not least because if, say, the law is permissive, or the law is receptive, or the law allows for the more tolerant interpretation, then there is a political space for all of these other actors, for courts, for NGOs, for activists, to just lobby for the implementation of the law. I think it makes this task of toleration, the task of kind of promoting non-discriminatory policies easy. I mean, it doesn't mean that the law would automatically lead to these kinds of practices, but at least there is a possibility that these kind of practices would ensue. And in this regard, it's interesting to note that despite this growing sort of anti-immigrant sentiment that many speakers already talked about, despite this growing xenophobia that shows in the polls, in the post-Soviet region, people now are less tolerant, native people of migrants than they were even in the early 1990s. On the legislative front, it has been proved very difficult, and I'm sort of now working on it to try to figure out why, so I don't really have an answer why. But clearly, if you look at the legislative debates in Russia, for example, despite this growing sentiment that all of these Tajiks, Georgians, Armenians are kind of undesirable as either disease carriers or, criminals and so forth, and who really want these Slavic people to come in, like this, Russians, maybe Ukrainians and Belarusians. It has proved pretty much impossible to have anything to that effect reflected in the law. There have been all these attempts to define Ruski, like Russian nation, who exactly is Russian. There is a law on the compatriots, but the compatriot definition, again, is so vague that it sort of it does include the Tajiks and all the, although nobody wants them included. And I think that's really interesting. Sort of why is it, even given this perception, this very strong feeling, and they would even say that, Putin's representative in the Duma during the debate of the citizenship law in 2002 specifically said, we don't want the Tajiks and all their tubiteki standing here in the train station, and then Tajik embassy issued a protest. But so even though they would go as far as accepting their sort of racist, intolerant attitudes, they still can't have them reflected in the law. And I don't think that's insignificant, because I think it does create at least the possibility for promoting more inclusive and tolerant integration policies. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Okay, and now we'll move on to Devlet Kuda-Nazarov.
Yeah, now, good afternoon. I'm very happy to be part of this panel with very beautiful ladies and high-level experts and with very good English. I would like to remind my colleagues of the main reasons for Tajiks to migrate out of their homeland. The first major migration to Russia took place after the February events of 1990. Demonstrators taking part in the protest in the front of the Central Committee building in Dushanbe were shot by government troops. For Russians and Russian-speaking citizens, it was a signal for approaching instability, forcing them to leave Tajikistan. 2 years later, the social unrest turned into civil war, accompanied by the ethnic cleansing based on the regional identity. Russian as well as Tajiks started fleeing Tajikistan. Tajikistan officially reached peace accord in 1997, but economic crisis and unemployment still forced people to stay outside the borders of their motherland. Since that time, refugees became labor migrants. Also, the number of the migrants started to increase due to the inflow of new immigrants coming to Russia in search of work. It should be noticed that the absolute majority of them came to Russia just to earn some income and afterwards return home. It is very important to understand migrants' level of integration into Russian reality. I believe that Tajik labor migrants were an hour to the systematic and long-term unemployment and economic crisis in Tajikistan. I would like to remind you that during the Soviet era, up to 40% of Tajik economy was supported by Moscow. The collapse of the Soviet Union severely damaged Tajik economy that resulted in closure of numbers of economic strategic infrastructure, consequently decreasing workplaces. Money sent home by labor migrants could have revived the national economy if there emerged favorable conditions for establishment and development of small and medium range businesses. Otherwise, money sent back to migrant families are simply spent for food and thus do not become catalyst of any economic reforms. Over the last 5 years, the number of labor migrants from Tajikistan who arrived to Russia, according to the different sources, varies from 400,000 to 1.5 million people. I believe that the more realistic number is approximately 800,000 people. According to the 1989 census, the number of Tajik was around 36,000 in Russia. Maybe it is not only in Russia, but outside of Tajikistan and Uzbekistan on all the territory of former USSR, except Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, 36,000. However, according to the 2002 census, the number of Tajiks who obtained Russian citizenship increased up to 20,000 people. And this happened within 13 years. One would wonder why was the number so small comparing to date of other ethnic groups from the former USSR. In summer 1996, Russia and Tajikistan ratified the agreement of dual citizenship. In such case, the number of Tajiks that were granted the Russian citizenship should have increased. So why didn't it happen? There are several reasons explaining why a number of labor migrants did not become Russian citizens. A psychological factor seems to be one of the most important indicators. First, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, many of the former USSR citizens believed that the country would reintegrate in one way or other and did not feel the necessity to become a citizen of another foreign country and adapt to new living conditions. Second, the overwhelming majority of Tajik labor migrants hoped that after the civil war and establishment of peace in their motherland, everything would come back to normal, to their pre-war Soviet life, the kind of condition which would allow them to return home. And third one, the inner resistance of people to part with their motherland, which I believe is very strong sentiment of Tajik mentality, and particularly from Tajiks from mountains area. And finally, there is the fourth reason. It's bureaucratic barriers hindering migrants' legalization in Russia. The long list of necessary and unnecessary documents which a migrant has to submit for obtaining the legal status is not the main problem. The bigger issue is the level of humiliation one has to undergo while dealing with authorities in the process of legalization, both in motherland and in Russia. At the very beginning, when powerful migration flows consisted of hundreds and thousands of people, the immigrants became an easy prey of dishonest officials and individuals. People began to face all kinds of barriers, immediately starting in their own backyard, as they had to bribe almost every official in the process with the money taken as a credit. The extort money from Central Asian migrants became a lucrative business. Labor migrants, while passing endless corridor of humiliation, started to lose their individual and identity and very soon turned it into a social outcast. Despite thousands of Tajiks became Russian citizens, these were people who either persistently struggled to achieve their goals. 10 years ago, I recommended different families to purchase cheap housing in Russian regions and apply for citizenship. I selected two regions to be used as I selected two regions to be used as field for two pilot projects for Tajik families pursuing permanent residency in Russia. The first project had to be carried out in the village of Troitsk, Lev Tolstoy district of the Lipetsk region. The second one was in the settlement Stavrovo, the Vladimir Oblast. However, before recommending people to move into any region, it was necessary to conduct the needs assessment and found out. First, the level of pollution of environment, including radioactive pollution. Second, level of tolerance of local residents toward non-Slavic people. Third, road infrastructure, communication to local center and railway station. Fourth, presence of secondary school in the village. Fifth, presence of health center or first aid station. Sixth, presence of post office, telegraph, stationary telephone line. And seven, the degree of fertility of land and other conditions for agriculture activities of farming and stock breeding. What were the prospects for settlers? It is easier to register and obtain a residency right once the family buys a house and land and resettles in the region. This way, they will be able to apply and receive Russian citizenship and Russian passport at a nominal fee in accordance with the current citizenship laws. This will enable them to live in Russian Federation permanently and enjoy all rights of Russian citizens. Tajik migrants who will obtain Russian citizenship will be able to retain their Tajik citizenship. However, it was necessary to take into account the interest of Russian state in general and interest of local population in particular. As the new immigrant had to not only abide by the Russian laws, but also by culturally sensitive to the local population. Also, I asked the settlers not to exceed the limit of 12-13 families per district, even under the most favorable condition. I'm not an advocate of compact living, so I fully realize its importance for retaining native language, culture, and tradition. Moreover, it is no less important to show respect towards the local culture and local residents as well. That should lower the risk of any potential ethnic conflicts and tensions. 10 years passed, and today I counted 70 Tajik families living in Troitsk and neighboring villages. More than 100 people became Russian citizens. Those regard this experience as a successful one. At the same time, a resettlement project was implemented in Stavrovo in the Vladimir region. We had difficulties with settlers registration. Also, local militia sometimes reacted inadequately. However, after some negotiation with local authorities, we finally managed to overcome all the obstacles by giving the reasons and explanations to why people have become migrants to Russia and where they were coming from. At present, the settlers managed to establish friendly relations not only with their neighbors, but with all local administration as well. There are 16 Tajik families, and over 70 people became Russian citizens. We had some bad experience as well. This one happened in Tver region. The settlement where the families arrived was called Pogorelye Городище, a burned settlement, if to translate. The migrants decided to settle there without consulting with me. They partially paid for their houses and asked me to help them in funding interest-free credit to pay the rest of the price. Finally, 8 families settled in. In 2005, 3 years later, during the first 3 months of the year, 3 houses were put on fire. Thanks God, nobody was injured. However, the houses were burned to the ground. Militia acted passively and formally. 4 families sold their houses and left. 1 family of 5 remained, but was constantly fined and humiliated as the authorities used all kinds of absurd reasons do not process their residency documents. At the end of January, Lydia Grafova, a famous journalist and human rights activist, wrote the article about this family and published it in the governmental Russian newspaper. The family still has a lot of difficulties, but after the publication of the article, the elder daughter was granted permission for permanent residency, and I hope that the family will get the same status by the September of this year. The family were advised to leave, but they were determined in their decision to stay. Despite the dire need for the mother to fund money for her urgent eye surgery, the already vulnerable family took a credit and invested in one of their daughters' education. I warned them that the publication of the article may worsen their situation, but Shahlo, the second daughter, said, let it become worse. The main thing is that now people know the truth. Isn't it really best one? Isn't it really unfair that I won at the Students' Olympic, that my composition in Russian are one of the best, and at the same time my parents had been fined because of me? When I asked what she wanted to do after finishing school, she told me, I would like to study at the juridical faculty to be able to protect the vulnerable people. It seems to me she would be a very valuable addition to any Russian community. In conclusion of my presentation, I would like to draw your attention to rather alarming social symptoms. This year, Moscow is witnessing resurgence of the skinheads. Over the first 3 months, the number of skinheads victims, labor migrants, increased 3 times if compared with last year, the same time. Only the small part of Tajikistan, Pamir, 6 coffins have been shipped from the Moscow region with bodies of cruelly murdered migrants. According to incomplete statistical data, over the first 3 months, Tajikistan received 210 coffins shipped from Russia. The present social political process in Russia are not monolithic. The same is for the migration policy. As we can see, the changes from the ultra-reactionary tendencies to the reformative ones. One of those reactionary tendencies can be exemplified by the case of Vyacheslav Postovnin, the deputy of the head of Migration Service of Russia, who was dismissed this last January. He stood for liberalization of migration policy in Russia and made a tremendous progress during his short term on that post. A continuous struggle is going on between these two tendencies, two forces. The world community should take those factors into account and make the adequate contribution, bearing in mind Russia's relative potential. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. We have about 40 minutes now for questions, and the discussion here on this panel is moving more toward the case of post-Soviet Union, but we can also address questions to some of the earlier speakers this morning.
Yes, you want us to identify?
Yeah, please say your name and your answer. Here comes a microphone.
Yes, I'm David Abramson. I'm an analyst at the State Department, and I cover Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. And I have a couple of questions, and both of them relate to gender, actually, for both Cindy and Davlat Khuranazarov. One is for Cindy Buckley. I'm just wondering what the gender factor is in constructions of the diseased other. While most of the migrants who come to Russia are men, my understanding is that the vast majority of labor migrants from Kyrgyzstan have been women, although that's starting to change as there have been crackdowns on markets and construction areas is increased. So I'm just wondering how women are constructing, whether this makes any difference, or is it just too abstract and out there for people who are. I'm sure that you have an answer for that. And then in terms of becoming citizens, why are, my understanding is that Kyrgyz are becoming citizens at a faster rate than Tajiks. And I'm just wondering, given the factors that you gave, what explains this?
You want to go ahead?
Yeah.
Oh, do you want
Yeah, do you want to? Yeah.
Okay. David, thank you for that question. The gender element is really important. And in terms of the way it manifests itself in health, most of the literature now does focus on male migrants, and particularly in terms of the HIV links, the Spitzer corollary, you don't need to cross an international border to engage in risk behaviors, has not really caught on there. So the focus is on male migrants and their risky health behaviors, although all of the evidence we have from other countries points that it's internal migrants as well as international. In terms of the gender effect, what's interesting, and this is again based on preliminary analyses, because this is a project that's starting in the fall, that interestingly enough, obstetricians asked in Moscow very clearly talk about how non-Russian women have poor prenatal care, and they don't follow instructions, and they show up to the hospital late. Which is interesting because they have better birth outcomes. So it doesn't really fit too well. I haven't seen any of that literature. This is work done from the Institute of Sociology. I don't know how that relates specifically to Kyrgyzstan, but in terms of Moldova, I think the Kyrgyz case is different because most Kyrgyz women are working in factories. In the Moldovan case, the female diseased other is that female migrants are all prostitutes. A shocking fact I have been told several times. And so that's the way in which the diseased other sorts of gets manifested, so that people will actually ask, well, no, it's okay to go to that brothel. They're not Moldovans.
Yeah, about citizenship, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, absolutely right. For Kyrgyz people, it is easy to obtain citizenship of Russia because they have agreement. Kyrgyz citizens, they are refusing their citizenship Kyrgyzstan and accepting fully Russian citizenship, and it takes 3 months. During the 3 months, they can get citizenship of Russia. In Tajik people, it's the agreement making barrier for them, and it should be additional point between two governments, Russia and Tajikistan. They should put additionally, but I think Tajikistan is with some kind of doubt not to do it. And but this is the first question made answer. But I am thinking, I'm wondering about generally about status of women. It is one of the painful issue. Generally, status of family going down. 70-80% of men, particularly young men, from 18 to 45 to 50, moving to Russia, and they are outside of their culture, and they are losing their identity, and the same time, women there in Tajikistan, children without father. And rate of marriage also go down. And I'm thinking that for Russia government, it is best time, and it's limited time, to accept Central Asian migrants. Because after 30 years, the level of the birth it go down, and after 30 years, nobody can come. Because the demographic today, people are thinking that, oh no, it is okay. But after 1 generation and a half, it will be clear that not reason now go to Russia, and also Russia losing a chance to have people with good English. But it is every day coming people with bad Russian, and it is the policy is. I told about two tendency, and particularly Vyacheslav Pastanin, he was with good understanding of this situation. And every year now people losing work ages 1 million, and during the next 10 years 10 millions will reduce And of course they need workers.
Okay. We have a question over here.
My name is Yaroslav Pelinsky. I'm from Kiev. I'm Canon Institute representative in Kiev and scholar from Ukraine. So I just wanted to know more. What sources have you based speaking about the healthcare? Yes, excuse me. I'm looking at you, so that's why So what sources have you used speaking about the healthcare of migrants in Ukraine? Can you clarify this?
And again, this,
Thanks.
like I said, this is really preliminary. Most of the quotes and the press review was based on Russia. In the Ukraine situation, working with individuals at the Ministry of Health, as Oksana had also mentioned, the more robust nature of the NGO sector in some ways that focuses on migrant rights does provide a lot of stopgap care. And so it's, while certainly this idea of migrants as the diseased other does come into play, I really would leave that either to Blair or Oksana to really talk about in terms of health in Ukraine. In terms of how it's seen in receiving countries who send migrants to Ukraine and come back, so the Southern Caucasus, what they argue there is that it's just too expensive. And so it's more of an economic cost in the Ukraine. But I want to couch that by saying this was based on a small sample of 45 families. And so when in the families, there were 7 that sent workers to the Ukraine. When they came back, they would never go to the doctor, first because they were trying to stay in the shadows because they were there without work permits, and secondly because it was too costly. But clearly much more work needs to be done. Now, I will say that the Ukraine National Aid Center does not post their statistics by migrants and or places of origin and destination. So kudos to them on that front. And so I think it's an excellent question, and I'm sorry, but at this point I really don't have the empirical data to work on it. All indications point to economic barriers, as well as Oksana so clearly pointed out. It's a slightly better healthier health environment. Can we say that? Okay.
Thank you.
We have a question over here.
Hi, Leila Keogh. I'm at the Kennan Institute. I'm a research scholar here. I study Moldovan women migrants who go to Turkey to work as domestic workers, actually. My question actually doesn't have to do with that, but with gender and migration, but actually with the fact that what's come out in this panel and in the last one, I think, too, is the fact that integration is really a problem of sort of xenophobia and intolerance and racism in the host countries. And I'm wondering if there's any NGO or legal activity that's targeted at the populations of those host countries, natives or locals, that we talked a lot about NGO activity that services the migrant communities, but not so much at those that are targeted at the host community to fight that racism and xenophobia and also to help integration. Thank you.
Let's take a couple more questions. There's one over here.
I can say something about it. Blair probably can say more.
Dan Kazmar, I'm a research associate for the Institute of European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at George Washington University. Is there a religious aspect to this also, say, Muslim versus Russian Orthodox? It just hasn't been mentioned.
Oksana, did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, let me just say a little bit, and Blair can probably add more because really all I know is about more specifically about refugees than about migrants in general. One of the things UN has been involved with is precisely these kind of activities you mentioned, promoting tolerance and sort of knowledge who the refugees are. And they've done some like even TV ads campaign. There is the Refugee Day that is, I think it was June 20th, so every year they would hold, actually in Ukraine I think they even had a football match competition between refugees and the Ministry of Interior passport and visa officials. So that was quite interesting. I mean, talking about, right, yeah, so these kind, and it actually does help. I mean, they do it, in different towns. So that's really the only one I'm aware of, sort of, and I'll defer to others who might know about specific, NGOs that would engage in this kind of activity. Can I just ask, so taking advantage of the tech microphone, ask Cynthia to follow up on this health question, right? One thing, it would seem it would affect the access of migrants to health services. is on what basis they are allocated, right? So if, say, you are a migrant in Russia or Ukraine, I mean, up until recently, Propiska, this residency registration, has been critically important. So if you want to get any health care, you have to have this residency stamp on your passport, which allocates you to the specific clinic, where you can go get services. And with these reforms of this Propiska system, I mean, in Ukraine, it really, from what I understand now, maybe you could correct us if that's wrong, I think it became really permissive. Now you just have to go and sort of declare, okay, I live at this address, but there are no longer these stringent requirements attached that you have to have so many square feet and so forth. And I wonder if that affects now, like, do these migrants, if, say, they, I mean, a lot of them obviously don't register, but if they do register, can they then go to the local clinic and get health services? I mean, what happens if they call, like, the emergency, like, 03 ambulance? Does it come and, like, I don't know, a bit, I'm wondering, because for refugees there is this, as you mentioned, again, the UN has been providing kind of these ad hoc health services for the refugee population. They basically paid a local hospital to treat these people. So in the 90s, all these refugees in Kiev would be directed to this, what was it called, Blair? Like the oil or something, like the clinic of the oil and gas, something rather. So, and again, it wasn't anything official, just UN gave money to this hospital and then refugees would go there. But if you're not a refugee, then the question would be like, does this Propiska regulations, because if that varies, that could have something, an impact on the kind of things you're looking at. I don't know,
yeah, I think it would.
I don't have negative facts of some kind of problems between Orthodox and Muslims in the regions, but seems to me the Orthodox people and priests, they should be more actively to defend Muslims in the region. When in the two cases in Troitsky and in Vladimir, in Stavrova, before to start it, I came and I met priests and I informed them that that we have an idea to bring, and they said welcome. It was not any problems. About NGOs, we have several NGOs, Tajik NGOs in Russia, and one of them you said about Tajikistan. Its founder was my wife, and she's with her colleagues every day. They are receiving phone calls, emergency phone calls, during the 24 hours a day. The people with number of phones, including a home phone, including cell phone, and they are calling and they are informing, and we are trying to help. We have a specialization. My wife more with police, with militia. My specialization, health and death of people, and this is. But in the beginning, it was very difficult. But now it's people are trying to make some unity and to make to build some structure to defend them.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any questions? There's one in the back over there.
Hi, my name is Maggie Asdabi Katz. I do work on migration in Georgia, and I have a question for Cynthia. I was wondering if you could talk about how the public perception of the disease other has translated in both the receiving countries and sending countries. For example, how are returning migrants welcomed? Has it changed in the last couple of years in terms of how the community receives them? Are they discriminated against in employment if they're known as return migrants? And on the same end, has this shifted at all? Has this sort of trickled down into the day-to-day lives, or is it still at a propaganda level?
I have not come across any studies about how it is translated into, say, subsequent employment restrictions or maybe impediments on the marriage market or something like that. I would proffer that it's a complex propaganda situation, because at the same time you have the portrayal of the diseased other, you also have economic incentives that are working the other way. So you're coming back and you're suspicious because you might have picked up TB or STD, or you might now have a drinking problem, but you may be the only person in the community with resources. those two things may balance out in different ways. If I could, because your question is interesting and to link on gender, Erin, do you want to add anything about women migrants in Georgia?
I mean, from my own research, it sort of seemed like there were, that there were pretty strong, there were associations between female migration and engaging in prostitution and coming back as other. But within women's own immediate social circles, the families and friends tended to make exceptions. Well, yes, all female migrants are prostitutes, but not my friend. So there seemed to be a lot of protective factors of the sort of immediate social circle. Oh, and I'm Erin Hoffman. I'm a graduate student at University of Texas.
Blair
Rubel here at the Wilson Center. My question is for Patricia, and you gave a very interesting window on different pathways based on certain experiences of the different distinct communities. But these are communities that arrived in Canada at different times. And I'm just wondering if the Canadian side of the equation entered into this as well. Did it make a difference that the Chileans came earlier? And are there differences in perceptions among Canadians about the different groups? Is there any sort of Canadian part of the story?
Yeah, I think that there is length of residence in host society is one of the indicators that are usually used to explain political behavior among immigrants. And we have tried to move away from that to say, yes, there are differences in the host society or the reception in terms of political opportunity structure, institutional landscape that affect the way in which the different migrant organizations, whether it's Chileans, Central Americans, or Colombians, are able to engage, right? So we can talk about, but it's not actually, it's counterintuitive. Chileans enter a context in which, if we can talk about a set of settlement organizations that are supposed to receive Latin American immigrants and all immigrants in Canada, when Chileans arrive, there is no settlement landscape. Right? And by the time the Colombians arrive, in fact, there's a very well-established settlement landscape. So Chileans enter into a context where no one speaks Spanish because they are the first Latin American group to arrive. I mean, there's Ecuadorians previously, but very small groups. So no one speaks Spanish. No one knows what to do with this really militant, well-organized refugee group when there was and that has a high degree of support among the Canadian left. So the Canadian churches, the Canadian unions receive these people with open arms, but in terms of a settlement landscape, there's nothing there, right? By the time the Colombians arrive, there's a very it's an industry, right? It's a machine. You process people. So the change, so in fact, what we're interested in is, well, how do relations between migrant groups and this institutional landscape change over time? And for us, the importance is in getting at the ways in which immigrants organize, right, and explaining why they organize in the particular ways that they do, whether it's through partisan groups or through social movements or in very apolitical fashion, is really fundamental to understanding the way they relate to Canadian institutions, although we obviously see this changes in the host society landscape over time, right? So I don't know if that partly answers. I think the other thing which relates a bit to, one of the discussions we seem to be having is around whether xenophobia or tolerance or intolerance are kind of innate or constituted through institutional processes, right? And I think that obviously, the Canadian example, Cynthia keeps going, we should send Canadians out, you guys know how to be tolerant. Well, no, actually, there's like a 40-year investment in making that a possibility through a set of institutions, right? So I think that is if there's a Canadian model that is about, funding, mediating institutions that allow for these spaces of dialogue between migrants and non-migrants, right? So.
Sure.
Oh, I'm Caroline Bertel from SMU. Just following up, Patricia, I think the other dimension, first of all, to think about your work moving beyond Irene Blumrod's work, which was quite interesting, comparing the U.S.-Canadian context, and I think you're taking in very interesting directions. But what I'm wondering about is what's happening in the pan-Latino space. In other words, there's these separate groups in Canadian societies, but of course we're wrestling even, at least some part of the work that we're doing in Dallas is dealing with two Asian groups and Pan-Asian space and whether people even identify with the Pan-Asian space. So I'm just wondering in the Canadian context, because we have such a powerful model of Latino, Hispanic in the U.S. context, but what's the Canadian counterpart?
Yeah, that is actually really interesting because every Latin American group that arrives in Toronto and in all settlement cities across Canada begins by organizing based on national origin. But Canada is an ethnicizing state. It determines that if you want to be heard by the government, you need to constitute yourself into a tolerable and coherent pan-ethnic based on shared language or shared region. So we have the idea of the South Asians, of the Hispanic / Latin American. Latino is not really a concept that's used very often. And so within that, what's interesting, and we've tried to track this, when we did those focus groups and look at these pathways, we said we have these very strong national origin organizing trajectories and the constitution of the Center for Spanish-Speaking People, the Hispanic Development Council, and other organizations that kind of came in and out of the picture, and how those country of origin-based agendas impose or demand and frame the kind of Hispanic project that gets constituted in Canada. So on the one hand, yes, there is this constitution of a pan-ethnic in order to be present in the kind of the funding structure to be recognized by the state, because the state doesn't recognize you as, just one little group, right? But on the other hand, that Hispanic or Latin American organizational trajectory requires dialogue with all of these other country of origin-based groups because they're very well organized and because no one, unlike here where you can say, well, Salvadorans dominate DC, right? So Carecen or Casa, yes, they're multi-Latino and multi-ethnic, but they come out of a history of Salvadoran organizing, right? In the Toronto context, no group dominates, right? And there is this requirement of kind of juggling between the multiple country of origin and that dialogue with the Canadian government, right?
Okay, we have 3 questions. Let's take them together. There's one right there, and then over here, and then over here.
Thank you. I'm Dr. Macaulay. I teach at Marymount and Australia Universities in Arlington. You talk about the political socialization in Canada based on gender, ethnicity. And I was wondering if you could say something about race.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Let's go ahead and take the questions. Yeah.
Okay, this may be going back to the earlier half of this session, but it was something I wanted to raise. There were some references to use of open space, and my question would go to any of the panelists on either occasion. Observations about, with respect to their nation or the particular countries they've studied, where migrants use open space, and even where, and I'm thinking of Washington, D.C., where those natives almost withdraw from open space, as I see a richness, for instance, of migrants on the shores of the Potomac having picnics, and almost our own suburbanites not going to these beautiful sites, but perhaps staying in their homes for recreation and the like. So I'll leave it at open space, and I wouldn't mind if there were a few arguments about culture as well, where there's a meeting of musical tastes as between migrants and natives.
I also have a very short question to Patricia. So I have an experience to talk with Chileans in Sweden, for instance, and as far as I know, many of them go back to Chile. What is the situation in Canada? So do they return? Or? Thank you.
Okay, Patricia, do you want to?
Yeah. I was sitting quietly thinking this would all be about the former Soviet Union. Okay, so on race in Canada, let's be clear, there's racism in Canada, and there is a racial hierarchy, and there is racialization of poverty, and the worst neighborhoods are the darker neighborhoods, okay? The question is, why don't people organize around race, right? What kind of ethnic politics does multicultural Canada constitute that makes it so difficult for people to say, as people of color or as racialized groups, we share things in common? And it is multiculturalism. makes it very difficult. It demands that constitution of the political subject as an ethnic, under-racialized subject. If you live in Toronto, you see that the kind of immigrant advocacy groups and the groups that are concerned with the living wage and with neighborhood issues are trying to push the idea of race and racism and racial hierarchy. But in the history of early settlement organizations of immigrant groups, that really does not come out. It comes out later, and it's complicated. So I hope that partially answers the question. Briefly on the notions of space. Toronto, unlike most American cities, doesn't have these, they're very residentially dispersed. So Toronto, you don't have huge concentrations of any particular group in any particular location. Every neighborhood is, first of all, 50% of the population of Toronto is foreign born. Okay? There are 180 language groups. There is no ghetto of any sort, and the issue of occupying space, it's this rotating, except in winter, which is like 9 months. So those other 3 months, there's this, it'd be great if we were just further south. There's this kind of different groups, whether it's ethnic group, religious group, whatever, it occupies public spaces for moments, and then all of a sudden you go, oh my God, I didn't know there were so many people from Ghana in the city, because all of a sudden they're all there, right? So the use of space is not tied to that kind of ghettoization of newcomer populations. So I'll just leave it at that. And in terms of Chileans, first of all, yes, there were projects of return, and we can't count how many people stayed in Chile. We see people going back to Chile post-1986 when the lists on exiles, people were banned from Chile, right? In 1986, the lists of the exiled not allowed to return were lifted, and people begin to return. Some people returned previous to that to join the underground opposition. Most of them were killed. There is this kind of back and forth because reincorporation into Chile is very difficult, as it is with most return migrations, right? But the story of the return, as organizing the way Chileans related to Canada in those first 10 or 15 years, we talk about this living out of suitcases, right? Not bothering to really learn the ropes for yourself. Your kids would, but you wouldn't, so that preparation for going home whenever Pinochet had finished, right? So.
And then were there any more response to the question of the use of open space and culture? And did you want to take a shot at that? Okay. Let's do one final round of questions.
Yes, I'm just curious about how Kazakhstan, as a new growing destination for migrants from Central Asia, and I know less about the Caucasus, how that differs in terms of your work on the diseased other and constructions, but any other comments on Kazakhstan as a growing, compared to Russia, and how they're being received?
Hi. Ricardo Gambetta with the National Eco Series here in Washington. I have a question about Canada. That is a very interesting topic. Did local government play any role, important role, in the process of integration, assimilation of immigrants in Toronto?
No. You know what? It's a real problem because immigration policy is run at the federal level. Quebec has a provincial level immigration policy, but cities bear the brunt of the implications of dealing with immigrant populations, right? Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, and to a growing extent Calgary, and they have no control over the budget that would be required. There's now, Toronto has recently signed an agreement with our current Prime Minister, Conservative government, Steve Harper, to say that any immigration policies Canada talks about, there'll be a discussion with Toronto. But in fact, last week there was a huge scandal because the Minister of Immigration came into City Hall, met with the Conservative city councillors, and didn't even tell Mayor Miller that he was showing up. So clearly there's a bypassing of that relationship. So no.
Okay, go ahead.
We'll go back to the Kazakh case. Interestingly enough, given the very cold reception of Georgian migrants, and it's going to get colder all the time, back into Russia, one would have expected that Georgian migrants would have then directed towards Kazakhstan, a growing economy that is definitely a prime destination. By all demographic estimates and all of the studies done by ILO as well as local scholars in Georgia, that's not the case, that they have turned to Europe, to Turkey, even though oftentimes we're finding 3-4 attempts to get out and to get into labor arrangements in that direction. There is the idea of going to Kazakhstan to work is just not something that the Georgians seem to take to. On the converse side, among Azeri labor migrants, there are a large number of Azeri migrants, particularly in the construction industry, who are working in Kazakhstan as well. And one might explore issues of religious tolerance and kind of that sort of shared cultural background. I'm not really sure how that works. In terms of Armenians, because of the incredible network in Russia, Armenians just aren't going to Kazakhstan. They don't have as strong a network, and so they're still going into Russia in large numbers. Now, from data that I have from Kazakhstan, it does appear that in terms of education and age, the selectivity of Central Asian migrants going into Kazakhstan is slightly lower. They tend to be older and less educated than Central Asians from Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan going into Russia. But that's based on official statistics, and I think that only gives us a very small number of the total migrant movement.
During the Civil War, when it was ethnic cleansing and many people left Tajikistan, and people came, some part of them came to Kazakhstan, and including intellectuals from Tajikistan. And thanks Aljas Suleymanov, Aljas had a strong position to help and to defend our people. And in the beginning of '93, I met him there, and he tried to organize a meeting with the president and involve the president to be a peacemaker. We did not succeed, but generally the intellectuals who came, and they are close to Aljas groups, and they made a good foundation for new people to come. And if people coming to Kazakhstan from Tajikistan and they are looking not job there, they are moving across the Kazakhstan to Siberia. But a new tendency for migrants, labor migrants, most people coming from Uzbekistan. It's from neighboring towns and places. They are coming and they are working there.
Did you have a question?
Yes, actually, I want to ask a question. I want to ask you a question. You mentioned how this demographic issue that now there may be, Russia may just have several years to sort of have more migration come in, with the families and so forth. And I wanted to ask you if this new legislation that they now have in Russia, this program on the return of compatriots that got passed, I think it was the end of 2006, right? Like if any of the Tajik, migrant families or, just new migrants are taking advantage of this program. I understand that sort of the numbers that I've seen, it's relatively few people came, but I'm not quite sure like why that is the case and sort of what the obstacles are, because for a long time the migrant assisting organizations in Russia have been saying that Russia needs precisely this kind of program that would enable the people who are culturally similar, given their shared Soviet background, to come to Russia to help address these demographic concerns. And this program, on paper at least, it says that's precisely the goal of this program. But I wonder in practice, like if you know like how it's being used and if
Yeah, if we are looking declaration, yes, open door for all the former USSR citizens, but in the practically, they are encouraging Slavic people to come. And sometimes correspondents asked migration's top-level officers about the particular, and they said, oh yes, if, for example, the Tajik, he's a professor of Russian language in university, why not to accept him? But it is, I'm thinking that today, tomorrow, they are not accepting, but later on, it's not choice, because the economic, if economic situation improved, not choice. They should bring more people. If economic crisis and the social crisis, of course they can stop. And it's again depend to the top level policy. There is some people who were around Putin. They had very conservative position for migrants, and it's now right now it is not clear if maybe some people around Medvedev can have a more liberal position. We are depend to that situation.
Okay. Thank you very much, and please join me in thanking all of our panelists.